from Iranian state television, which screened what it claimed was the launch of the first missile to be sent towards Israel. As we know, Tehran said it had achieved its objectives. So now, of course, the world is watching and waiting to see what step Israel will take next. Going through the papers with me, Harrison Griffiths, political commentator with Young Voices UK, is here. Harrison, a very good morning.
Hi, Rosie, how are you?
I'm really well. I think lots of people were shocked on Saturday evening. We knew some kind of retaliation was coming, maybe not in the shape or the extent that it did. Harrison, you know, The Guardian's saying the US has got this warning to Israel. What do you imagine is going to happen next?
Well, I don't think any sovereign country in the world, not the UK, not the US, not Israel, could stand for what has happened over the last few days and not retaliate against it. This is a pretty unprecedented move, even for such an unstable region. Iran uses its proxies in Lebanon and Syria very frequently, and of course Gaza, to attack Israel. But we have not seen for a very long time a direct attack from Iranian soil, and this was a flurry of missiles and drones headed towards Israel proper. Thankfully, most of them got shot down. I think only 7 actually landed, according to the Israelis.
And clearly,
but it's nonetheless something that no country can withstand without retaliation.
Had they not been intercepted by us, the US, and Israel, I mean, it would have been catastrophic.
Yeah, absolutely. It could well have been. And it's also worth saying it's not just us and the Americans and the Israelis. You see, I mean, there's a lot of fog of war. It's not all confirmed, but you see Jordanian jets in the sky shooting these missiles down in defense of Israel. There's apparently Saudi involvement in shooting these things down. You've seen a very long-running realignment in the Middle East play out. It would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago, never mind 20, 30, 40 years ago, to see Arab countries around Israel joining Israel in effectively defense of the state proper. It's because an awful lot of countries realise that the Iranian regime led by these fundamentalist mullahs is the biggest threat to security in the region. I
mean, the Prime Minister says calm heads must prevail. In terms of our involvement, what shape do you think that should take?
I think, we have to stand pretty firm in defence of our allies, of the only liberal democracy, multi-ethnic democracy in the region in Israel, but we also have to stand in defence of our treaty allies in the region, like Jordan as well, who are also under threat from this Iranian regime. That's something I think that even further tinges this whole conflict with tragedy, is that it may come as a surprise to an awful lot of people that Iran was actually the second Muslim majority country in the region to recognise Israel when it first became a state. For a long time, Iran and Israel were reasonably close partners when Iran was ruled by the Shah. Pro-Israel and anti-Semitism protests in the UK, you will often see people waving green, white and red flags with a golden lion in the middle. That is the pre-revolutionary Iranian flag. Iranian dissidents and people who despise the theocratic regime in Iran are often very sympathetic to Israel and want the two countries to have ties again. I think Israel and the Iranian people share a common enemy in this regime.
We're going to be live in Israel in about half an hour's time to really look and assess particularly what the population want the Prime Minister to do next. So more of that to come. Westminster returns. The Easter recess is over. The front page of the Times has got this story, Harrison. Britain may try to send migrants to Costa Rica. And it's not just Costa Rica, it's also Botswana, potentially Armenia, the Ivory Coast. This is kind of replicating the Rwanda scheme elsewhere. Is that a good idea?
No, because I think we've seen what's happened with the Rwanda scheme. There was a story 2 weeks ago that, coming off the back of lots of stories that the Rwandans were not confident that this was actually going to get seen through. Apparently some of these places that were built to house migrants have been sold to local Rwandans now. The legal, moral and political impediments to such a scheme remain in place. I mean, I'm actually in Armenia right now. They've just had an influx of 100,000 refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh, which was a majority Armenian area that was it's in the territory of Azerbaijan and was for a long time a kind of breakaway state that was reoccupied by the Azerbaijanis fairly recently. And I don't think that there's going to be an awful lot of appetite around here to basically house the UK's to solve the UK's immigration problem, in a sense. So if it's not worked out with Rwanda, which has very kind of openly marketed itself as an area that, the government has openly marketed itself as an entity that's happy to deal with Western countries to help solve migration problems.
Yeah,
I don't think it's going to work anywhere else very quickly.
To give you an idea, the Times analysis this morning says, well, the government's spoken to representatives of these countries about a deal similar to that's sort of been pitched in Rwanda, although progress with all four has stalled owing to difficulty with the Rwanda scheme. And the hope, the expectation, Harrison, is that negotiations can resume once removals to Rwanda are taking place, when they can say, look, this now is a success story, so we can expand elsewhere.
Well, I think that doesn't look like happening anytime soon, and this government's running on borrowed time. It took long enough to set up the Rwanda scheme. It's taken long enough for it to be implemented. I'm not sure that the lesson from that experience is to expand such programmes.
Well, we'll be looking at the inevitable ping-pong again of the Rwanda legislation in about 15 minutes' time when we go through the politics. The other thing that's back on the agenda is, of course, the smoking ban, which feels distinctly unconservative. And yet we are going to be a world first in effectively ruling out smoking. The warning, though, that the Prime Minister is getting, I'm looking inside the Telegraph now, Harrison, is that the smoking ban, I think we kind of maybe expected this, is going to be very difficult to enforce.
Yeah, understatement of the century from Ken Clarke here. It's going to be impossible to enforce. It's going to be absurd to enforce. Even if you could, you'd be looking at a situation where a 27-year-old is prohibited from buying tobacco product, but their 28-year-old friend is not. And anybody that was ever 17 at any point in their life will know that their mates a year older will just buy tobacco products for you. It's not particularly it's not particularly difficult to see why this ban is going to be incredibly difficult to enforce just on that basis, never mind the rest.
But does it being difficult to enforce, does that mean it's a bad idea?
Yes, in a lot of, you don't need to start with the practicality case to know why it's a bad idea.
Tell me why.
In a liberal democracy, I think it's incumbent on governments to respect the wishes of people to do with their own bodies as they wish, to a very large degree, and it should be something quite extraordinary to stop people doing so. And I think tobacco has been around for a very long time in an awful lot of countries, and it's very difficult to stop people from using it. And I don't think that this ban is going to stop that fact. I mean, in Bhutan is one of the very few countries that's attempted an all-around prohibition of tobacco. It ended that prohibition about 5 years ago, and rates of smoking among all age groups, including under 18s, had risen during the prohibition period. Unless you're willing to settle for extremely draconian restrictions on civil rights, which most liberal democracies are not
keen on,
prohibition
clearly
does not work.
Well, it didn't work in New Zealand because actually just the figures, the sums didn't work up, which is why the new Prime Minister decided actually this isn't going to work. Obviously, Boris Johnson described it as absolutely nuts, but I think we know his views on banning it. And I think he made particular reference to Churchill and his cigars and said, this was sort of also distinctly unconservative. Those are the views.
To be fair, it's partly his fault. You can't extricate this policy from Boris Johnson. He was a very nanny statist Prime Minister in an awful lot of regards. He commissioned the Smoke Free 2030 review, and he is not an advocate of liberty in lifestyle, and it's quite strange, I think, to see him of all people voicing his opposition to this, because he is a banny state Prime Minister as well.
Well, his quote's in the Times too, so you can make your own mind up. There's a fascinating piece, Harrison, in the Times about ADHD treatment and the tips on TikTok for how to claim for disability payments. Tell me what's happening.
Yeah, so there has been a growing trend for a long time of people talking about ADHD as the condition has become a lot more visible, and it seems to have culminated in a bit of an industry developing on TikTok of people explaining how you can claim disability payments for it. As somebody who suffers with ADHD and has done for their whole life, this marks it's a symptom of a bit of a worrying turn, as I see it, in that for so long ADHD was a condition that was completely overlooked. And we're now in a position where it's become more visible, and that is undoubtedly a good thing. But you are very often see on social media people claiming ADHD symptoms and traits, which are just normal struggles of human day-to-day existence, really. And I'm concerned that it's becoming a bit of a kind of, I'm not going to say commodified, I really hate that word, but it's becoming a kind of status symbol for a lot of people to claim an ADHD trait, and now we're going the other way. From so long, this
from it being
disorder was
stigmatised to also almost a badge that you can wear proudly.
Yeah.
And what's happening is people on YouTube and TikTok are kind of putting out step-by-step guides on how to claim for benefits. And they're suggesting in the Times that nearly £300 million a year is being spent on disability payments. So it's well worth a read as well. Just very quickly, Harrison, while you're here, there is an interesting proposal being put forward by the AA about regulations that should be on. We've talked about the nanny state already. But on new drivers, and they're suggesting if you're a new driver, young drivers, maybe there should be a sort of a graduated scheme when you get your driving licence that would mean for the first 6 months when you get it, you can't drive around your peers. Do you think that would be a good idea?
No, it sounds completely ridiculous to me. Like the generational tobacco ban and so many more policies, we are creating this concept of what my colleague at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Christopher Snowdon, calls this concept apprentice adulthood. I think at a certain point, when people reach a certain age, you have to trust them with all the rights of adulthood or not at all. And this is a classic example of it. Insurance exists for this very reason. I know it sounds awfully unfashionable in an equality and anti-discrimination defined age, but young men paying higher insurance fees is a good thing. Statistically speaking, they are not good drivers. I was once a young man. I thought I was a pretty reasonable driver, but even then I probably wasn't, and a lot of my friends were definitely not. And this is why we have insurance, to kind of punish bad behaviour. You do not need the government coming in and restricting people's right to drive when they are perfectly capable of doing so.
When they've passed their driving test.
To do so. Yeah, pass your driving test, be able to drive. The rest of it should be a negotiation with your insurance company.
Harrison, thank you very much. Harrison Griffiths, political commentator from Young Voices UK, with some fairly strident anti-nanny state views.